I saved a patient by stopping an impaired surgeon, and it destroyed my life. I stopped an intoxicated surgeon from operating on a patient, and it destroyed my life. I'd just started at a new hospital, and it was my first time assisting a complicated heart surgery. The lead surgeon was Dr. Kettlebell, who'd performed thousands of surgeries and had an incredible reputation. When I arrived in the prep area, Dr. Kettlebell walked in, and something was immediately wrong. He stumbled slightly when he moved. His words were slurred when he greeted the team. And when he got close to me to look at the patient chart, I smelled alcohol on his breath. He was drunk. My stomach dropped because this couldn't be happening. The patient was already being prepped for anesthesia in the next room. I pulled aside the head nurse and whispered that something was wrong with Dr. Kettlebell. She looked at me like I was insane. He's fine. He's been doing this for 20 years. I insisted that he'd been drinking and shouldn't be operating. She told me to drop it and get back to work. The anesthesiologist was already putting the patient under in the operating room. Dr. Kettlebell was scrubbing in at the sink. I went to the surgical supervisor and told her we had a problem. She got angry immediately. Do you have any idea who you're accusing? Do you know how many lives Dr. Kettlebell has saved? He's forgotten more about surgery than you'll ever know. I could see through the window that the patient was on the table now, completely unconscious. Dr. Kettlebell walked into the operating room and picked up a scalpel. His hand was shaking. I made a decision right there that I knew would probably ruin me. I walked into that operating room and stepped directly in front of him. I cannot assist in this surgery, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Kettlebell is intoxicated and should not be operating on this patient. The entire room went silent. You could hear the monitors beeping. Dr. Kettlebell tried to push past me, but I blocked him. Someone needs to call another surgeon right now, or I'm walking out of here and reporting this directly to the medical board. The supervisor finally agreed to call in another surgeon. Dr. Kettlebell ripped off his gloves and stormed out of the room. Everyone stared at me like I'd just committed murder. The replacement surgeon arrived 20 minutes later and performed the procedure successfully. The patient survived. I went home that night thinking I'd done the right thing and saved someone's life. The next morning, I got called into the hospital administrator's office. There were 3 people waiting for me, including the head of HR and the chief of surgery. They told me I was being terminated immediately for insubordination and disrupting a critical medical procedure. I tried to explain that Dr. Kettlebell had been drinking and shouldn't have been anywhere near an operating room. The administrator slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were written statements from 5 staff members who'd been in that room with me: the head nurse, the anesthesiologist, 2 surgical techs, and the supervisor. I read through them with my hands shaking. Every single statement said the exact same thing. Dr. Kettlebell had been completely fine and professional. Every single one said I'd become hysterical and made a scene for no reason. These were people I'd worked with, eaten lunch with, and they were all throwing me under the bus to save themselves. The administrator leaned forward. We're also reporting this incident to the state medical board. You'll be lucky if you keep your nursing license. I tried to argue, but they told me security would escort me out if I didn't leave voluntarily. I cleaned out my locker that day while everyone avoided looking at me. A week later, I got a letter saying my nursing license was under investigation. I applied to 12 different hospitals over the next month and got rejected from every single one. Then one night, I got a text from a surgical tech I'd worked with. I'm sorry about what happened. You need to know the truth. She told me that Dr. Kettlebell had a drinking problem for 5 years. The hospital administration knew about it the entire time. He brought in millions of dollars in revenue and had powerful friends on the hospital board. They'd been covering for him and rotating staff to make sure someone was always watching him during procedures in case something went wrong. But I didn't know about the system. I didn't know I was supposed to quietly handle it. I'd exposed their liability by making it public in front of witnesses. So they destroyed me to protect him and protect themselves. 6 months later, my nursing license was permanently suspended. But I wasn't going down without a fight. Dr. Kettlebell was going to learn. 6 months after that operating room, I sat cross-legged on my apartment floor with the letter spread out in front of me. The state medical board's official seal stared back at me, and those 2 words kept jumping out no matter how many times I read them. Permanently suspended. My nursing license was gone. I picked up my phone and opened my banking app for the 3rd time that hour. The number hadn't changed. $2,000 left in savings, maybe enough for 2 months of rent if I ate nothing but ramen. Every hospital within 100 miles had my name flagged in their system. I'd applied to all 12 of them and got the same response each time, either silence or a polite rejection email. The patient from that surgery was alive and walking around somewhere because I'd stopped a drunk surgeon from cutting into his chest. But right now, sitting here with eviction notices in my future, it felt like I'd just destroyed my own life for nothing. I spent the next 3 days on my couch in the same sweatpants, letting my phone buzz with calls from my parents that I couldn't bring myself to answer. I scrolled through job listings for positions I wasn't qualified for anymore. Retail associate, warehouse worker, delivery driver. None of them paid enough to cover my bills. I ate cereal for every meal and watched the sunlight move across my apartment walls. On the 4th morning, I woke up and something felt different in my chest. Not hope exactly, but something harder and angrier. The hospital had destroyed me to protect their money and their reputation. They'd coordinated lies and manipulated the medical board to save a surgeon who operated on patients while drunk. If they were going to ruin me for doing the right thing, I was going to make absolutely sure that everyone knew exactly what they'd done and why they'd done it. I dug through my phone until I found the text message from Moira, sent a week after they fired me. I'd read it dozens of times, but now I looked at it differently, searching for details I might have missed. She'd said there was a system for watching him. She'd said the administration knew for 5 years. That meant somebody had documented this somewhere. There had to be emails, incident reports, staff schedules showing the rotation pattern, and if Moira knew about it, that meant other people knew too. Other nurses who'd watched him operate drunk, other staff who'd been told to keep quiet. They were all still working there, still protecting themselves, but maybe one of them had a conscience that kept them up at night. I created a new email account, something generic that wouldn't be traced back to me immediately. I spent 20 minutes writing and rewriting a message to Moira, trying to sound careful but also desperate enough that she'd understand I needed help. I asked if she'd be willing to talk more about what she'd told me, about the system and who else knew. I hit send and then sat there staring at my inbox, refreshing it every 30 seconds. 2 hours later, her response popped up. She'd meet me at a coffee shop on the other side of town, nowhere near the hospital where someone might recognize us. Her message sounded scared, but I could also hear anger underneath it, and that gave me the first real hope I'd felt in months. She was scared, but she was also mad enough to help me. We met on a Tuesday afternoon when the rain was coming down hard enough to keep most people indoors. The coffee shop was nearly empty, just us and an older man reading a newspaper in the corner. Moira looked thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping well. She bought a coffee she didn't drink, and we sat at a table in the back. She told me she'd been feeling horrible for months about what happened to me. She knew I was right about him being drunk that day. She explained that at least 6 other staff members on the surgical team knew about his drinking problem, but every single one of them was too terrified of losing their jobs to speak up. The hospital paid well and jobs were hard to find. People had mortgages and kids in college, so they all stayed quiet and participated in the system that kept him operating while impaired. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her contacts, then wrote down 3 names on a napkin and slid it across to me. 3 other nurses who'd rotated through his surgical team over the past 5 years and had witnessed him showing up drunk to procedures. One of them had quit 2 years ago, just walked away from the job because she couldn't handle the stress of watching him operate while knowing he was impaired. Moira said that nurse had told people she was leaving for family reasons, but really she just couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Then Moira mentioned something else, something about someone from patient advocacy who'd gotten fired 3 years back for raising concerns about his surgical outcomes. She couldn't remember the name, but she thought it was a woman, and she'd been let go quietly with some excuse about budget cuts. The next week, I spent every free hour researching lawyers online. I looked up medical malpractice attorneys first, then switched to attorneys who specialized in professional licensing cases. Most of them wanted retainers of $5,000 or $10,000 just to take a consultation, money I absolutely didn't have. I filled out contact forms on 20 different law firm websites, explaining my situation in careful detail. Most never responded. A few sent back polite emails saying they couldn't help. Then I found Bridget Walsh's website. She specialized in fighting unfair license suspensions, and her page had testimonials from nurses and doctors who'd been wrongly disciplined. I sent her a long email laying out everything that had happened, and she responded the same day saying she'd meet with me for a free consultation to review my case. Her office was small and cluttered with case files stacked on every surface. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with red hair pulled back in a messy bun. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes in a legal pad and asking specific questions about dates and who said what. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. She said this was one of the clearest cases of institutional retaliation she'd seen in 10 years of practice. A hospital protecting a revenue-generating surgeon by destroying a whistleblower nurse who exposed their liability. She thought we had a legitimate shot at getting my license reinstated if we could prove the hospital had lied to the medical board to protect themselves and their surgeon. The problem was proving it. She explained that we needed people willing to go on record against their current employer, and nobody wants to do that because it means losing their job and getting blacklisted. We needed either hard documentary evidence of his drinking problem, like emails or incident reports, or we needed multiple witnesses who would testify under oath about what they'd seen. Without that, it was just my word against an entire institution's coordinated story. She asked about my financial situation, and I told her the truth, that I had maybe 2 months before I couldn't pay rent. She thought about it for a minute, then said she'd take my case on a reduced fee with a payment plan. It was the only way I could possibly afford her, and even then I'd be eating rice and beans for the foreseeable future. I used the names Moira had given me to start tracking down the nurse who'd quit 2 years ago. Her name was Rachel, and it took me 3 days of searching through social media and professional directories to find out she was working at a medical clinic in a suburb 40 minutes away. I called the clinic's main number and asked to leave a message for her. When the receptionist asked what it was regarding, I kept it vague and just said it was about a professional matter. That night, I called back and asked to leave a voicemail directly. I identified myself as the nurse who got fired for stopping the surgeon, and I said I needed to talk to her about what she'd witnessed during her time on his surgical team. I left my number and hung up, then spent the rest of the evening wondering if she'd actually call back or if she'd delete the message and pretend she never heard it. Rachel called me back 3 hours later. My phone rang while I was eating cereal for dinner, and I almost dropped the bowl grabbing for it. She sounded shaky when she said hello, but also kind of glad that someone had finally reached out. She told me she'd been waiting 2 years for somebody to do something about Dr. Kettlebell, because she still had bad dreams about watching him operate drunk. She quit the hospital because she couldn't handle the guilt of staying quiet anymore, but she was too scared to report it herself. I asked if she'd be willing to meet with me and my lawyer to talk about what she saw. She was quiet for a long time, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. Then she said yes. We set up a meeting for the next afternoon at Bridget's office. When I got there, Rachel was already sitting in the waiting area looking nervous. She was younger than I expected, maybe 26 or 27, with her hair pulled back tight. Bridget brought us into her office and Rachel started talking. She described 18 months of working on Dr. Kettlebell's surgical team and watching him show up drunk at least a dozen times that she could remember clearly. She explained how the head nurse would quietly put extra people on his surgeries when he was impaired, and they all had signals to use if something went wrong. Rachel pulled out a small notebook from her purse and my stomach flipped when I saw it. She'd kept personal notes with dates and details because she was so upset by what was happening. Bridget's eyes got wide when she started flipping through the pages. The notes had specific dates, types of surgeries, and descriptions of Dr. Kettlebell's behavior. Rachel had written things like slurred speech, unsteady hands, and smelled like alcohol. Head nurse assigned 2 extra techs. Bridget asked if she could make copies, and Rachel nodded. She said she'd kept the notebook hidden in her apartment for 2 years, not knowing what to do with it. Over the next week, Bridget worked on putting together a formal complaint to the state medical board. She included Rachel's written statement and copies of her notes. The complaint laid out everything we knew about Dr. Kettlebell's drinking problem and the hospital's system for covering it up. Bridget also filed paperwork to appeal my license suspension using this new evidence. She said Rachel's testimony was exactly what we needed because it proved I wasn't making things up or being dramatic. 2 weeks after we filed the complaint, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said her name was Heather Zimmerman, and she used to work in patient advocacy at the hospital. She'd been fired 3 years ago for raising concerns about Dr. Kettlebell's surgical problems. She told me she heard through people she used to work with that someone was finally investigating him, and she wanted to help. I gave her Bridget's contact information and we set up another meeting. Heather showed up with a manila folder stuffed with papers. She spread them out on Bridget's desk, and I saw incident reports and tracking sheets. Heather explained that she'd filed these reports about weird patterns in Dr. Kettlebell's complication rates. She'd noticed his bad outcomes were clustered on certain days and times. When she brought it to administration, they told her to stop tracking his surgeries. 2 months later, they fired her for performance issues that she said were made up. She'd kept copies of everything and had been working at a different hospital ever since. Bridget looked through the documents and got excited. She said between Rachel's notes and Heather's incident reports, we had enough to really push the medical board investigation. Then she brought up something that made my chest tight. She thought we should consider going to the media because sometimes public pressure moves things faster than legal processes. I felt sick thinking about making myself more public when I was already struggling to find work. But my savings account was almost empty, and I was running out of options. The medical board sent a letter a few days later saying they were reviewing our complaint. The letter said these investigations usually take 6 to 12 months. My license appeal was moving just as slowly through all the official channels. Bridget warned me that the hospital had expensive lawyers who would fight us at every step, and this whole thing could take over a year to finish. I started applying for any job I could find that didn't require a nursing license. A diner 3 blocks from my apartment was hiring waitresses, and I took the job even though the pay was terrible. The work was harder than I expected after years of nursing. I spent 8-hour shifts carrying heavy trays and dealing with rude customers. My feet hurt so bad at night that I could barely walk to my bed. I came home every shift with grease stains on my clothes and smelling like fried food. My parents called and offered to send money, but they were both retired and living on fixed income. I told them I was doing okay even though I was barely making rent. 3 months into fighting the hospital, I hit a wall. I was exhausted all the time from working at the diner and stressed about money. The hospital was still running normally, and Dr. Kettlebell was still doing surgeries while I served pancakes to pay my bills. Nothing seemed to be changing no matter how hard we pushed. I called Bridget one night after a really bad shift and started crying on the phone. I asked her if we should just give up because it felt like we were fighting a system that was too big to beat. Bridget let me cry for a minute and then started talking in her calm lawyer voice. She reminded me that big institutions change slowly, but we were building a really strong case. She'd been gathering more evidence and had filed public records requests for Dr. Kettlebell's surgical complication rates. The hospital was fighting the requests hard, which she said actually made them look guilty. She told me to hang in there because we were making progress even if I couldn't see it yet. A week later, my phone buzzed with a text from Moira saying she had more information and needed to meet right away. We sat in the same coffee shop across town, and she looked even more nervous than last time. She told me another surgical nurse still working at the hospital wanted to talk, but was scared to death of being identified. Moira had convinced her it was important, and set up a meeting for that afternoon at a library 2 towns over. The nurse showed up wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap like she was in a spy movie. She sat down at our table and refused to give us her real name. She said she'd been on Dr. and Kettlebell's team for 8 months, and had watched him show up drunk to surgery twice in the past 3 weeks. She described how the first time was a valve replacement, and his hands were shaking, so bad that the head nurse had to guide his movements without making it obvious. The second time was just 10 days ago during a bypass, and he could barely stand up straight at the table. The team had to work around him and basically perform the surgery while he pretended to be in charge. She said both patients survived, but it was pure luck and the skill of everyone else in that room. I asked her why nobody stopped him, and she just stared at me like I was stupid. She said everyone knew what happened to me, and nobody was willing to lose their job and license like I did. After she left, I felt sick knowing he was still operating on people while drunk, and the whole system was just letting it happen. The anonymous nurse had given us something even more valuable, though. She explained that the hospital had an informal system they called the kettlebell protocol, where certain senior staff got assigned to his surgeries, specifically to watch for signs he was too drunk. She said they had code words to signal each other if he was impaired. If someone said they needed more suction, it meant his hands were shaking. If someone asked about the patient's temperature, it meant he was slurring his words. If someone mentioned the time, it meant he was so drunk they needed to take over without him noticing. She described how they'd been using this system to prevent disasters for at least 4 years that she knew of. They had a rotation of experienced nurses and techs who knew how to quietly manage him during procedures. The senior staff would position themselves strategically around the table, so they could intervene quickly if needed. She said they'd successfully prevented multiple catastrophic errors by essentially performing surgeries while Dr. Kettlebell stood there pretending to be in charge. The whole thing was coordinated and organized, which meant the administration had to know about it. Nobody creates a system like that without approval from the top. Bridget's eyes got huge when I told her about the protocol. She said this was exactly the smoking gun we needed because it proved the hospital administration knew about Dr. Kettlebell's drinking problem and created an organized system to manage it instead of stopping him. She started talking fast about how this showed deliberate knowledge and institutional liability. She could subpoena internal hospital communications about surgical team assignments and scheduling records related to Dr. Kettlebell. If we could prove they were deliberately rotating certain staff to watch him, it would destroy their defense that they didn't know he had a problem. She filed the subpoena that same week, requesting all emails and memos about Dr. Kettlebell's surgical assignments going back 5 years. The hospital's lawyers responded within 2 days, fighting the subpoena and claiming it was overly broad and violated privacy. Bridget said their aggressive response actually helped us because it showed they were scared of what those records would reveal. She filed a motion to compel, and we had a court hearing scheduled for 6 weeks out. 4 months into the investigation, my boyfriend told me he was done. We were sitting in my apartment after I'd worked a double shift at the diner and spent 3 hours on the phone with Bridget going over case details. He said he couldn't watch me destroy myself over something that might never be resolved. He said I was obsessed and it was taking over my entire life. He told me I needed to just move on and accept what happened and start rebuilding instead of fighting a battle I couldn't win. I tried to explain that this wasn't just about me anymore, but about stopping Dr. Kettlebell from hurting patients. He said I was using that as an excuse to avoid dealing with my own life falling apart. He said he loved me, but he couldn't be with someone who was so consumed by anger and revenge that she couldn't see anything else. We fought for 2 hours and he finally left and didn't come back. I spent the next week crying between dinner shifts and barely sleeping. I'd lost my career and now I'd lost the person I thought would stand by me through this. Every morning I woke up in my empty apartment and had to force myself to get out of bed and go serve coffee to people who had normal lives. My parents drove 6 hours to visit me after they heard about the breakup. My mom took one look at my apartment and started crying. The place was tiny and kind of dirty because I'd been too exhausted to clean. I'd lost probably 15 pounds from stress and eating irregularly because I couldn't afford much food after paying rent and legal fees. My mom wanted me to pack up and come home with them and give up this whole fight. She said it was killing me and nothing was worth destroying my health and happiness like this. My dad didn't say much at first, but after my mom went to the bathroom, he pulled me aside. He told me quietly that he was proud of me for standing up for what was right, even though it was costing me everything. He said most people would have given up by now, and the fact that I was still fighting meant I had more courage than he'd ever had. He slipped $200 into my hand before they left and told me not to tell my mom. It was the first time in months that I felt like someone actually understood why I couldn't just let this go. I started having panic attacks before my shifts at the diner. Every time I saw someone walk in wearing scrubs for breakfast, my chest would get tight and I couldn't breathe right. My hands shook so bad when I poured coffee that I spilled it twice in one morning. I broke 3 plates in 2 weeks because my hands wouldn't stop trembling when I picked them up. The diner manager finally pulled me aside during a slow afternoon and asked if I was okay. Something about the way she asked just broke me, and I started crying right there in the kitchen. I told her the whole story about Dr. Kettlebell and losing my license and how I was barely holding myself together. I expected her to be annoyed that I was falling apart at work, but instead she just listened. She surprised me by being incredibly kind about the whole thing. She said her sister had died from a surgical error 15 years ago, and she understood why this mattered so much to me. Her sister had gone in for a routine procedure, and the surgeon made a mistake that caused massive bleeding. She died on the table, and the hospital claimed it was an unavoidable complication. Her family never got real answers about what happened. The manager said if I was fighting to prevent that from happening to other families, then she wanted to help however she could. She changed my schedule to give me more flexible hours so I could attend meetings with Bridget and court appearances. She said I could take time off when I needed it without worrying about losing the job. It was the first time in months that someone had shown me real compassion without judging me for not moving on. I went home that night feeling slightly less alone in all of this. 5 months after we filed the complaint, the medical board finally interviewed Dr. Kettlebell as part of their investigation. Bridget heard through her contacts at the board that he'd denied having any drinking problem and claimed I was an unstable new employee who panicked during a routine surgery. He said I'd misinterpreted normal surgical stress as impairment because I was inexperienced and overwhelmed. His lawyers had provided the same 5 statements from the staff members who originally lied about what happened that day. They painted me as someone who cracked under pressure and made false accusations to cover up my own inadequacy. Bridget said his defense was predictable, but frustrating because he had expensive lawyers coaching him on exactly what to say. The medical board investigation was moving slowly, and we still didn't have enough evidence to overcome all the people willing to lie for him. Bridget decided to track down the anesthesiologist who'd been in the operating room that day and signed a statement saying, "Dr. Kettlebell was fine." She called him and explained that she was representing me in the license appeal and wanted to talk about what he actually witnessed. She offered him immunity from any consequences if he'd tell the truth about Dr. Kettlebell's condition during that surgery. He refused to meet with her and said he had nothing to add to his original statement. But Bridget said his voice on the phone was shaky and nervous. He kept asking what kind of immunity she could offer and whether other people were cooperating with the investigation. She said his nervousness suggested he knew he'd lied and was worried about the consequences if the truth came out. He wouldn't agree to talk, but he also didn't sound confident in maintaining the lie. Bridget thought if we could get enough other evidence, he might eventually crack and admit what really happened. I found out through Moira that the hospital administration had been actively intimidating witnesses. They'd sent out a memo to all surgical staff saying that anyone who cooperated with outside investigations would be terminated immediately for violating confidentiality policies. Several nurses who might have been willing to talk were now too scared to come forward. Moira said people were genuinely afraid of losing their jobs and being blacklisted like I was. The hospital was using the same tactics on potential witnesses that they'd used to destroy me. They were actively working to make sure nobody would testify about Dr. Kettlebell's drinking or the protocol they'd created to manage him. Every time we got close to finding someone willing to talk, the hospital would shut them down with threats. I felt like we were fighting an opponent with unlimited resources and no conscience about destroying anyone who got in their way. 6 months in, and my apartment looked like someone had given up on life. Dirty dishes filled the sink because I kept forgetting to run the dishwasher. Laundry piled up in corners because folding clothes felt impossible when I could barely get out of bed. I'd lost 15 pounds from skipping meals and surviving on coffee and whatever was easiest to grab. The nightmares came every night now. Always the same scene of walking into that operating room and everyone staring at me like I'd done something terrible. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing and couldn't fall back asleep. I called Bridget on a Wednesday afternoon from my couch where I'd been sitting for 2 hours staring at job rejection emails. My voice cracked when I told her I didn't think I could keep doing this anymore. The hospital had unlimited money for lawyers, and I was working double shifts at the diner just to pay rent. Every time we got close to finding evidence, they shut us down or threatened witnesses into silence. Bridget listened quietly and then asked me to meet her at her office the next morning because she had something to discuss. I almost said no because getting dressed and leaving my apartment felt overwhelming, but something in her voice made me agree. That same week, everything changed in a way I never expected. Bridget called me Thursday morning before I even got to her office and told me to come in immediately. A patient who'd had surgery with Dr. Kettlebell 2 years ago had contacted her after hearing about the investigation through medical community gossip. The patient's name was Eric, and he'd had a valve replacement that resulted in major complications requiring 2 additional surgeries to fix. He told Bridget that during the original surgery, he remembered waking up briefly from anesthesia and hearing the surgical team arguing in panicked voices. He'd always suspected something went wrong that they didn't tell him about because the team seemed disorganized and scared when he came out of recovery. His medical records showed complications that shouldn't have happened with a routine valve replacement. Eric was willing to testify about his experience and let us review his complete surgical records. I sat in Bridget's office reading through Eric's file and felt hope for the first time in months. This was outside verification from someone who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by coming forward. Then on Friday, another former patient called Bridget's office. This woman named Linda had a bypass surgery with Dr. Kettlebell 18 months ago and experienced unusual bleeding that required emergency intervention. She remembered the anesthesiologist looking worried and extra nurses being called into the operating room. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more patients contacted us. Each one had surgeries with Dr. Kettlebell, and either had complications or remembered the surgical team acting strangely. One patient's son was a lawyer who offered to help us organize all the patient testimonies and medical records into a format the medical board couldn't ignore. We met with all 5 patients over a 10-day period and recorded their statements. Every single story included details about panicked staff members or unusual complications that suggested something was wrong during their surgeries. One patient named Robert remembered his wife telling him that Dr. Kettlebell had seemed unsteady on his feet when he came to check on Robert before surgery. The patient testimonies changed everything because they provided verification from people outside the hospital system. These weren't staff members who could be intimidated or fired. These were patients who'd trusted Dr. Kettlebell with their lives and deserved to know if something had been wrong. Bridget worked for 3 days straight, organizing all the statements and medical records into an amended complaint. She filed it with the state medical board on a Monday morning and requested an immediate suspension of Dr. Kettlebell's license pending full investigation. The complaint was 40 pages long and included detailed testimony from 5 patients, statements from Rachel and Heather, and documentation of the hospital's cover-up system. 2 weeks later, the local newspaper ran a small story on page 6 about a medical board investigation into a veteran surgeon at a major hospital. The article didn't name Dr. Kettlebell yet because the investigation was ongoing, but it mentioned allegations of impaired surgery and institutional cover-up. The hospital issued a statement the same day denying all allegations and defending their safety protocols. I read the article 3 times sitting at the diner counter during my break. It was the first time anyone outside our small group had acknowledged publicly that something might be wrong. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number. The man on the phone identified himself as Scott Bowers, an investigative journalist for the newspaper who'd written the article. He asked if I was the nurse who filed the complaint against Dr. Kettlebell. My hands started shaking because talking to media felt dangerous after everything the hospital had done to destroy me. I told him I needed to call my lawyer before saying anything. Bridget called me back within an hour and said it might be time to go public with my story. The medical board investigation was moving, but slowly, and public pressure could speed things up. She suggested we meet with Scott to hear what he wanted before making any decisions. We met him at a coffee shop downtown on Thursday afternoon. Scott was probably 40 with graying hair and glasses, carrying a worn leather bag full of notebooks. He ordered coffee and pulled out a file folder before explaining that he'd been covering medical malpractice stories for 15 years. He listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes and asking specific questions about dates and who said what. When I finished, he sat back and looked genuinely angry. He told me he'd been investigating the hospital for other stories and had heard rumors about Dr. Kettlebell for years, but could never get anyone to go on record. Staff members would talk off the record but were too scared to be named. He wanted to write a full investigative piece about the cover-up and how the hospital destroyed my career for speaking up. The article would expose the Kettlebell protocol and detail exactly how the administration enabled an impaired surgeon for years. But he needed me to agree to be named as the source and go on record with everything. I felt sick thinking about my name and photo in the newspaper for everyone to see. The hospital would come after me even harder and I'd never work in healthcare again. But I also realized this might be my only chance to force real change and stop them from doing this to someone else. I told Scott I needed a day to think about it. Bridget and I talked for 2 hours that night about the risks and benefits of going public. She warned me that the hospital would probably sue me, and that being named publicly would make finding future work even harder. But she also said that media pressure was often more effective than legal processes at forcing institutions to change. The next morning, I called Scott and agreed to the interview. We met at his office on Saturday and spent 6 hours going through every detail of what happened. He recorded everything and asked me to walk through the timeline multiple times to make sure he had it right. He also interviewed Rachel and Heather, who both agreed to be named in the article. 2 of the patients, Eric and Linda, agreed to share their stories publicly. Bridget reviewed Scott's draft article before publication to make sure we weren't compromising the legal case. She made him remove a few details that were still under investigation, but approved the overall piece. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday paper with a photo of me in my nursing scrubs from before I got fired. The headline read, "Hospital protected impaired surgeon while destroying whistleblower nurse's career." Scott had written 8,000 words detailing everything from the day I stopped Dr. Kettlebell to the hospital's intimidation tactics. He included quotes from Rachel and Heather about the Kettlebell protocol and testimony from patients about their botched surgeries. He'd even obtained internal emails through sources showing administrators discussing how to manage the situation. The response was immediate and massive. By Sunday afternoon, my phone was flooded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former nursing school classmates reached out saying they believed me and were proud I'd spoken up. Strangers sent emails through the newspaper saying they'd had surgeries at that hospital and were now questioning their care. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by 3 regional news stations and 2 medical safety advocacy groups. The hospital's main phone line was jammed with calls from concerned patients demanding answers. Local news crews showed up at the hospital entrance interviewing patients and staff. The hospital administrator issued a statement by noon saying they took all safety concerns seriously and were conducting an internal review of their protocols. The statement didn't mention Dr. Kettlebell by name or acknowledge any of the specific allegations. It was the same corporate language they always used to avoid admitting wrongdoing. But something had shifted because now everyone was watching them. The first call came through Scott 2 days after the article ran. A nurse who'd worked with Dr. Kettlebell 3 years ago wanted to talk. She was scared of losing her job but said she couldn't stay quiet anymore after reading my story. Scott set up a meeting at the same coffee shop where I'd met Moira. The nurse told me about 5 surgeries where Dr. Kettlebell had shown up drunk and the team had to work around him. She remembered specific dates and patient names. 2 more nurses contacted Scott that same week. One still worked at the hospital and insisted on meeting after dark in a parking lot 20 minutes away. She looked over her shoulder the whole time we talked. She told me the administration had sent an email to all surgical staff warning them not to speak to media, or they'd be fired immediately. But she said she had kids and couldn't live with herself if something happened to another patient. The third nurse had quit 6 months ago and moved to a different state. She did a phone interview with Scott and described the rotation system in detail. She explained how senior staff knew which surgeries to watch closely, and how they'd developed hand signals to communicate when Dr. Kettlebell was too impaired. Scott spent a week verifying everything the 3 nurses told him, and cross-referencing their accounts with surgical records he'd obtained through sources. He called me on Friday night saying he had something big. We met at his office and he showed me printed copies of internal hospital emails. The emails went back 4 years and showed the chief of surgery and hospital administrator discussing Dr. Kettlebell's drinking problem. One email from the administrator said they needed to manage the situation carefully because Dr. Kettlebell brought in over $3 million in revenue annually. Another email from 3 years ago mentioned that a patient advocate had raised concerns about his surgical outcomes, and they needed to handle it quietly. That patient advocate was Heather. The emails proved everything. The hospital knew. The administration knew. They'd chosen money over patient safety for years. Scott's follow-up article ran that Sunday with the headline, "Hospital Emails Reveal Years of Cover-Up for Impaired Surgeon." He quoted from the internal emails and included statements from all 3 new nurses. The article detailed how the administration had created the rotation system specifically to manage Dr. Kettlebell's drinking, rather than stopping him from operating. By Monday afternoon, the state medical board issued a press release. They were expediting their investigation and placing immediate temporary restrictions on Dr. Kettlebell's surgical privileges. He could no longer perform any surgeries until the investigation concluded. The hospital suspended him with pay that same day. Their statement said they were cooperating fully with the investigation and taking all allegations seriously. I read the statement on my phone during my shift at the diner and had to step outside because I started crying. It felt like vindication, but I was also furious that it took 2 newspaper articles and massive public pressure to get them to do anything. If I hadn't gone to Scott, if the story hadn't gone viral, Dr. Kettlebell would still be operating on patients right now. The hospital would still be covering for him, and I'd still be serving pancakes with a permanently suspended license. 3 days later, I got an email from someone named Jennifer Marks at the National Patient Safety Organization. She'd read both articles and wanted to know if I'd speak at their annual conference in 2 months. The conference brought together healthcare workers, patient advocates, and policymakers to discuss medical safety issues. She said my story was exactly what they needed to hear, because institutional retaliation against whistleblowers was a major barrier to improving patient safety. They'd pay for my flight and hotel and give me a $500 speaking fee. I called Bridget to ask what she thought. She said it was a great opportunity and would help build public support for my case. I emailed Jennifer back and agreed to speak. The next few months were a blur of waiting and legal proceedings. The medical board scheduled a formal hearing on Dr. Kettlebell's license for 8 months after my suspension. Bridget, Rachel, Heather, and I all had to testify about what we'd witnessed. The hearing took place in a government building downtown in a room with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs. Dr. Kettlebell sat at a table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. I testified first and walked through everything that happened the day I stopped him from operating. His lawyers tried to make me look unstable and inexperienced. They asked why I didn't follow proper chain of command. They suggested I'd overreacted to normal pre-surgery nerves, but I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. Rachel testified next and described the dozen surgeries she'd watched where Dr. Kettlebell was clearly drunk. Heather brought her incident reports and explained how the administration had silenced her. The patients who'd come forward testified about their complications and the strange behavior they'd witnessed from the surgical team. The hospital tried to claim the internal emails were taken out of context, but the board members looked skeptical. 2 weeks after the hearing, the hospital's lawyers contacted Bridget with a settlement offer. They'd withdraw their complaint against my license and pay me $50,000 if I agreed not to sue them and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Bridget came to my apartment to discuss it. She sat at my kitchen table and told me the offer was insulting. They were trying to buy my silence cheaply after destroying my career and putting patients at risk for years. She said we should push for full vindication and real accountability, instead of letting them sweep this under the rug with money. I agreed. I didn't want their money. I wanted everyone to know what they'd done. I called Scott and told him about the settlement offer. He wrote another article about how the hospital was trying to silence me with a private payout, while still refusing to take responsibility publicly. The article ran with quotes from patient advocacy groups and nursing organizations saying they supported my fight for accountability. 3 state legislators announced they were introducing bills to protect healthcare whistleblowers from retaliation. The public pressure kept building. 9 months after I lost my license, the medical board issued their decision. Dr. Kettlebell's license was suspended for a minimum of 2 years. He had to complete substance abuse treatment and monitoring before he could apply for reinstatement. The board's report was 30 pages long and included a section that said the hospital administration had enabled his impairment and failed in their duty to protect patients. I read the decision in Bridget's office with my hands shaking. The board also reviewed my case as part of their investigation. Their report said my actions were appropriate and potentially life-saving. They determined that I'd acted in the best interest of patient safety and followed my ethical obligations as a nurse. The board recommended immediate reinstatement of my license with a formal commendation for patient advocacy. I started crying right there in Bridget's office. She hugged me and said this was exactly what we'd been fighting for. But 2 days later, the hospital filed an objection to my license reinstatement. Their lawyers argued that I'd violated proper protocols by not following chain of command, and that my actions had disrupted a critical medical procedure. They said the medical board didn't have authority to overturn their complaint. Bridget was ready for this. She filed a lawsuit against the hospital for wrongful termination, defamation, and retaliation. The lawsuit laid out everything they'd done to destroy my career. It included the false statements from staff members, the coordinated effort to get my license suspended, and the internal emails proving they'd known about Dr. Kettlebell's drinking for years. We asked for damages covering my lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages for their deliberate retaliation against a whistleblower. The lawsuit was public record, and Scott wrote another article about it the day we filed. The discovery process started 3 weeks after we filed the lawsuit, and Bridget's office became filled with boxes of documents the hospital was forced to turn over. I spent entire days sitting at her conference table going through emails and meeting notes while she highlighted the most damaging sections. The first major find came on a Tuesday afternoon when I opened an email chain between the hospital administrator and the chief of surgery from 2 days after the operating room incident. The administrator wrote that they needed to neutralize me as a threat before I could cause more damage to the hospital's reputation. The chief of surgery responded with a plan to coordinate statements from the surgical team and report me to the medical board for mental instability. They discussed which staff members would be most reliable for writing the false statements and how to make sure everyone told the same story. I read through the entire chain twice with my hands shaking because here was proof in black and white that they deliberately destroyed my career. Bridget made copies of everything and added it to our evidence file while I sat there feeling sick. We found more emails over the next few days showing that multiple administrators knew the allegations against me were false, but proceeded anyway to protect Dr. Kettlebell and limit their liability. One email from the HR director specifically mentioned that my actions were technically correct from a patient safety standpoint, but that protecting me would expose the hospital to lawsuits about their failure to supervise Dr. Kettlebell. They chose to sacrifice me instead of admitting their own negligence. 10 months after I lost my license, Bridget called me early one morning with news that the hospital's board of directors had held an emergency meeting the night before. The board forced the administrator who terminated me to resign effective immediately, and placed the chief of surgery on administrative leave pending an external review of surgical department safety protocols. She read me the statement the hospital released to the press, which included a public apology to me for how they handled the situation. The statement announced major policy changes around impaired provider reporting and said they were implementing new protections for staff who raise safety concerns. I listened to Bridget read the whole thing while sitting on my couch in my pajamas, and when she finished, I just started crying. Scott called me an hour later to tell me he was writing a feature article about how my case had sparked national conversation about healthcare whistleblower protections. He said medical journals had contacted him for interviews, and patient safety podcasts wanted to discuss the case. I'd been interviewed by 3 different publications in the past month, and every time I told my story, it felt like I was reliving the worst parts. Scott mentioned that several other nurses had reached out to him privately sharing their own stories of retaliation for reporting safety concerns, and he was planning a follow-up series about systemic problems in healthcare institutions. The attention was overwhelming, but also validating because people were finally understanding that this wasn't just about one drunk surgeon or one corrupt hospital. 2 weeks later, the hospital's lawyers contacted Bridget with a new settlement offer that was completely different from their first insulting attempt. They offered full reinstatement eligibility, substantial financial compensation that would cover all my lost wages plus damages, and a commitment to implement comprehensive whistleblower protections. The settlement also included funding for a new patient safety position, and an independent reporting system for staff concerns that would be managed by an outside organization. Bridget reviewed every detail with me in her office and told me this was one of the best outcomes she'd seen in a retaliation case because it included both personal justice and systemic change. I signed the settlement agreement on a Thursday afternoon surrounded by papers while Bridget witnessed my signature. 11 months after my nursing license was suspended, a thick envelope arrived from the state medical board with official notice that my license was fully reinstated with no restrictions. I opened it standing in my apartment hallway, and had to sit down on the floor when I read the letter from the board commending my actions. The letter specifically stated that I upheld the highest standards of patient advocacy and acted appropriately to protect patient safety. I took both documents to a frame shop that same day and hung them on my living room wall where I could see them every morning. The hospital called 3 days later offering me my job back with full back pay and a promotion to a senior position in their surgical department. I listened to the HR director explain the offer over the phone, and when she finished, I told her there was absolutely no amount of money or title that would make me work in that environment again. I thanked her for the call and hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. Within a week, I started getting calls from other hospitals, asking if I was interested in positions, and several specifically mentioned they wanted to hire me because of my reputation for patient safety advocacy. A major teaching hospital 3 hours away called on a Monday morning with an offer to join their patient safety department. The position involved developing protocols for staff to report concerns without fear of retaliation and working with hospital leadership to create a culture of safety. The pay was significantly better than my old nursing job, and the director explained that they wanted someone with real experience standing up for patients. I accepted the position during that same phone call and started making plans to move. The patient safety conference was held in a hotel ballroom with about 300 healthcare workers attending, and I was scheduled to speak on the second day. I stood at the podium looking out at all those faces and told them exactly what happened to me from the moment I smelled alcohol on Dr. Kettlebell's breath to the day my license was reinstated. When I finished talking about how speaking up cost me everything but staying silent would have cost more, the entire room stood up and applauded. Multiple healthcare workers approached me afterward to share their own experiences with retaliation, and several were crying when they thanked me for speaking up. I exchanged contact information with at least 20 people and realized that my terrible experience had created an opportunity to help change how the system treats people who do the right thing. Scott sent me a link to a news article 2 weeks later about Dr. Kettlebell entering an inpatient treatment program for alcohol addiction. The article included a public statement where he took full responsibility for his actions and acknowledged that he put patients at risk for years. He apologized specifically to me for allowing the hospital to destroy my career rather than admitting he had a problem and getting help. I read his statement 3 times trying to decide if it felt genuine and concluded that it probably was, but it didn't erase the year of hell I went through because of his choices. The hospital issued another statement the following week announcing that the 5 staff members who wrote false statements about me were all facing disciplinary action. 2 were terminated immediately, 2 were suspended without pay pending further review, and 1 resigned before the hospital could fire her. I read through the announcement sitting at my new desk in my new apartment and felt mostly sad that they chose to protect the institution instead of doing what was right. A few months later, I got an invitation in the mail to attend a national nursing conference where Moira was receiving a patient safety award. I bought a plane ticket and sat in the audience watching her walk across the stage to accept the award while hundreds of nurses applauded. After the ceremony, she found me in the crowd and hugged me tight. She told me she was leaving the hospital to work in nursing education because she wanted to teach students about speaking up for patients and doing the right thing even when it's hard. We exchanged phone numbers and started texting regularly, and she became one of my closest friends over the following months. My first day at the new hospital in patient safety felt completely different from any nursing job I'd ever had. I walked into the office and met the team who would be working with me to create reporting systems for staff concerns. We spent weeks developing protocols that would let nurses and doctors report unsafe practices without fear of getting fired. I interviewed hospital staff about what would make them feel safe coming forward with concerns. Every meeting and every new policy felt like I was preventing what happened to me from happening to someone else. The work was challenging, but I went home every night feeling like I'd actually made a difference instead of just surviving another shift. 6 months into the job, I got a call from a patient advocacy group telling me that the state legislature had passed a new healthcare whistleblower protection law. They said advocacy groups had been calling it by my name during the campaign to get it passed. The law created legal protections and financial remedies for healthcare workers who faced retaliation after reporting safety concerns. 2 weeks later, I received an official invitation to attend the bill signing ceremony at the state capitol. I drove 3 hours to the Capitol building and stood in a room full of legislators and advocates. The governor walked in and gave a speech about patient safety and protecting healthcare workers who speak up. Then he called me up to stand behind him while he signed the law. Cameras flashed and I tried not to cry as I watched him put his signature on something that would protect other nurses from going through what I went through. I started getting emails and messages from some of the patients who had testified in my case. One of them told me he'd started volunteering with a patient safety organization in his community. Another said she was working with her local hospital to improve how they handle patient complaints. The patient whose family member was a lawyer told me he'd started a foundation to help patients navigate medical errors and advocate for themselves in the healthcare system. He asked if I'd be willing to serve on the advisory board, and I said yes immediately. The ripple effects of speaking up kept expanding in ways I never could have imagined when I walked into that operating room. Bridget called me one afternoon to tell me she'd just taken on 3 new healthcare whistleblower cases. She said my case had made her realize this was the kind of law she wanted to practice because it actually changed people's lives. She told me that having legal precedent from my case and the public awareness we'd created made it easier to represent other healthcare workers facing retaliation. We'd helped create real change in how these situations got handled. Hospitals were more careful now because they knew whistleblowers had legal protections and public support. 18 months after losing my license, I was thriving in ways I never expected. I'd moved into a better apartment in my new city with actual space and natural light. I adopted a dog from the local shelter, a mixed breed who'd been returned twice by other families but who slept next to my bed every night. The panic attacks that used to wake me up at 3 in the morning had mostly stopped. I was sleeping through the night again and eating regular meals. The financial stress that had crushed me for months was gone because I had steady income and was rebuilding my savings. The trauma was still there in quiet moments and probably always would be, but it didn't control my life anymore. I'd learned how to carry it without letting it destroy me. One morning, I opened my email and found an invitation from my old nursing school, asking if I'd speak at their graduation ceremony. They wanted me to talk to the new graduates about patient advocacy and ethical practice. I accepted immediately and spent weeks preparing what I wanted to say. The day of the ceremony, I stood backstage listening to the dean introduce me while my hands shook. Then I walked out to the podium and looked at 200 new graduates in their caps and gowns. I told them my whole story from the moment I smelled alcohol on Dr. Kettlebell's breath to standing behind the governor at the bill signing. I told them that doing the right thing sometimes costs everything you have. I told them that staying silent costs even more. When I finished talking, several students in the front row were wiping tears from their faces. Afterward, at least 30 students came up to thank me and tell me my story had changed how they thought about their responsibility as nurses. I drove home that evening thinking about how the worst year of my life had somehow led to the most meaningful work I'd ever done. I'd never get back the career I lost or the year I spent fighting just to survive. But I'd helped expose a dangerous system that had been hurting patients for years. I'd protected future patients from impaired surgeons and helped create laws that would protect other healthcare workers. Dr. Kettlebell had learned that corruption has consequences. I'd learned that speaking truth to power costs everything, but silence costs more.